and also in Japan, Confucianism is it highly developed a sense of morality, conduct across Asian cultures. So, for instance, we're going to talk about countries like Korea, China, and Japan, and they, from my experience, personal experience in Korea, when there was education classes up until maybe middle school, high school, there is a subject called ethics, or morals and ethics and morals, and they actually have this education class weaved into the curriculum of just even secular public schools, not just religious schools. So this idea of morality, this idea of right and wrong, this idea of conduct in a way that is, there is morality, right? This was deeply embedded in Korean culture, where it's heavily influenced by Confucianism. Most of its history, first of all, I believe that the first or the second unified empire was named Korea, and it didn't have any other foreign power that helped this nation to unify. So there is the Shilla dynasty, Korean dynasty, or Koryo dynasty, and then Joseon dynasty. There's three main dynasties that unified the Korean Peninsula. Korea was the only one that kind of independently, without any foreign power, became a unified nation. And that nation was unified also with the help of Buddhists. Buddhism was a unifying religion at that time. And also, but when it transitioned over to Joseon dynasty, basically Joseon dynasty was a nation that had Confucianists, and they were the main. It was almost a religion that centralized the Korean people at that time. So you can say, although there's a lot of Christianity in Korea and other religions are in Korea, Buddhism and Confucianism are still the main religion that controls the heart and soul of Koreans, because there's so much effect from that that comes from that. And generations after generation have believed in those things. Just like the West, where there generation after generation have believed in Christianity, Protestantism, or Catholicism, and they continue to have influences in their latter generations, right, in their descendants. So some could argue that religion is really a outcome of where you were born. So there is this argument that if you were born in an area, in a geographical location that is centralized by this one religion. So let's say if you were born in, let's say, a very heavily Islamic country like Saudi Arabia or any country in the Middle East that have like population, the majority is Islam. Then since your family, your mom, your dad, so if I was born in an Islamic family, I would not be here teaching at a Christian university. I would be at a Muslim university teaching. Does that make sense? So if you were born in a Hinduism family, your parents are Indian, your parents are Hindu, your mom's Hindu, your grandparents are Hindu, all your relatives are Hindu, the probability is you would likely be a Hinduist. Same with Buddhism, same with Christianity, same with Catholicism. If you're born into it, you're pretty much going to be that faith system, because faith is not just, or religion, faith is not just limited to what I believe in American idea of individuality and my will over these certain things it negates the very common, very prevalent idea of family. So, and family and community. So there is this argument that if you're born in that kind of religion or area, that you're pretty much going to be a part of that faith system. And religious education plays a huge role. Why am I talking about this? Religious education plays a huge role in that, where the education system of each faith is going to pretty much determine how you grow up in one's faith. So religious education is critical, and it plays those kind of roles in that kind of familial situation. So just as family and where you're born is huge, religious education is also very important. So that's what we're gonna look at today with different nations and each nation's history, each nation's religious background, and how that plays into our idea of religious education in these nations. So in Asia, I'm going to divide them into Central Asia, or South and Southeast Asia, and then Far East Asia. And for West Asia, I had Middle East basically. And also those stands, all the countries with the stands, Afghanistan, Pakistan, those are Western Asian. And the Far East Asians are Korea, Japan, China. The Central Asia, I think I have these countries such as Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and so on and so forth. But I also have these countries that have Soviet Union roots. So I have modern Russia as one of the countries that we're going to look at today. So this anthology in this book of religious education in the contemporary world includes nations such as number of Asian nations, such as what I just mentioned just now, and there is, because they revert to different national standards with their religious education, each nation is going to have a different systems of religious education, different ways of articulating these religious education. So we're gonna discuss religious education, but before we do that, I think there has to be a discussion on the parameters of what we're gonna look at today. In these parts of Asia, religious education, pretty much the Eastern world, much of history has been focused on the West. So if you look at historical books today, they are concerned about the West. All the revolutions started in the West. All the Industrial Revolution. You hear about the American Revolution. You hear about the French Revolution. You don't hear much about. I think maybe you hear about the Bolshevik Revolution. You don't hear much about what happened in the East. History is compiled in such a way that the Western civilizations are covered in detail, and yet in world history you don't hear much about what happened in the East. So you have to know that there is a bias. history books are biased, history textbooks that you learn are biased. But we need to understand that we need to go into religious education in the East with that kind of context, with that kind of idea that what we have learned in our education are biased, in our historical and religious education is biased. We are taught to focus on the Judeo-Christian aspect when the majority of the world's population believe in Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, so on and so forth. So hopefully I'll do justice in mentioning these things, in highlighting these things. But basically we'll cover different nations and then summarize their religious education systems. We're going to talk about religious system in Indonesia. Indonesia is an interesting nation because Indonesia is one of the most populous nations in the world. I think it's the fourth most populous nation. And in Indonesia, they recognize major religions. So they recognize Christianity, so Protestantism, Catholicism, and Hindu, Buddhism, and finally Islam. They recognize these nations as nations that religions that are recognized by the whole state. So these religions you can have them in the country, you can believe it, you can be a Christian, you can be a Buddhist, you can be, there's 5 main religions. But majority, not over 90% of the population is Islam, is the people who believe in Islam. They're Muslims. But Indonesia is a very populous country, is one of the, pretty much is, if you see a picture on the right, basically on your right, that's during the election. And it's one of the largest democracies in the world. And they project a population growth to about, it's already about the same as the United States of America. They are the most, if not the most diverse, because Indonesia has about 583 ethnic groups. They have local languages, dialects, not the same. It does have a common language called Bahasa Indonesia, but they have all these different minorities and groups and languages, dialects, and they have 5 officially recognized religions, as I said. Islam, about 88 to 90%. Christianity, Protestants, and Catholics, they divide that. Hinduism is 1.7%. Buddhism is 0.6%. And Confucianism. So Hindu, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam. I thought Christianity and Islam, they were divided, but I think they include Confucianism. Some include Confucianism, some don't. So each of these religions have equal rights and obligations, and each has a holiday, official holiday. So with Christians have Christmas, but by far the most recognized holidays are the Islamic holidays. They all have holidays, religious holidays recognized. And they have Indian holidays as well. The Indonesian Independence Day, they, in this idea of independence, they were colonized for so long. They were a Dutch colony for over 300 years, and they were a Japanese colony during World War II for about 30 years. In 1945, they finally gained independence and became a sovereign country. They wanted these kind of religions all accepted as a basis of their state. So consequently, Indonesia is neither a secular state or a religious state officially, but clearly it realizes that it is a Islamic country. Muslims are majority, so the education, Islamic education for Muslim is the majority. It happens to majority of the Indonesian people, 88%. So think about that. They have a population almost about 300 million people, and 88%, about 90% of 300 million people. So yeah, about 90% of that are Islam. So they undergo Islamic education. So if you want to study religious education in a huge country like that, they officially recognize these 5 religions, but you know that predominantly is a Muslim country because 88% of them are Muslim, engaged in religious education, Muslim education. So this is a study of Islamic education. So if you look at Islamic education in Indonesia, you can know that it is happening across the whole country. Indonesia, I said it delivers religious education by formal and informal means. And I talked about the religious schools of Islam, madrasa, and also other religious education in the masjid, which is the mosque. So formal education happens in the religious Islamic school or the mosque. Informal happens in the home with the parents. Lectures in the mosque are common. Imams, which are the religious clerics of Islam, they teach. Religious education in schools consists of 2 forms. First is religious education schools at a university level. The latter is the religious educational institutions in the form of malak, madrasa. Again, madrasa is very important in the Islamic religious system. Madrasa is a subsystem of the national education system. It comprises all school levels from primary school up to university. These 2 forms of education are called for in the National Educational Act of 2003. So it's in the law, it's legalized. That's what they do in Islamic countries such as Indonesia. And you can look at Indonesia and basically see how religious education systems work. So in previous periods, government marginalized religious educational institutions. Government didn't like them. So because of limited budget, limited acceptance, in the past, they had less support, and yet now it's a little bit different, where they have a little bit more funding, education systems. So this handbook not only will cover religious education in Islam, but also religious education as also a subject matter in Indonesia. So what does religious education look like in Indonesia? And in order to understand religious education, we need to look at education in Indonesia as a whole, because education is so important in Indonesia. So all citizens undertake 12 years of compulsory education. So Indonesians are highly educated, and they are literate. Consists of 6 years elementary, 3 at each middle high school level, so 6 years of middle and high school. And they are mostly, they also go to universities as well. As you know, that education in Indonesia, this is from World Education News, a article published in March 21st, 2019. At that time, in a census of Indonesian population was 264 million. That was 2017, right? It is the 4th most populous country in the world. It's also the largest archipelago in the globe. So it's an island chain continent. So from the eastern part and the western part, it's as similar to the east and the west coast of the United States. It's the largest archipelago on the globe. Its territory spans more than 17,000 islands that stretch for 3,181 miles along the equator between Pacific and Indian Oceans. 87% of the Indonesian population is Sunni Muslim, so 87 Sunni Muslim, making Indonesia the largest majority Muslim country in the world. Think about that. Indonesia is the largest Muslim populated country in the world. So this means what happens here is religious education that happens here is the standard of what happens in other areas of other Islamic countries, making Indonesia the largest Muslim country in the world. But the Southeast Asian country is simultaneously diverse, complex, multicultural nation of more than 300 ethnic groups. So hundreds of different languages with thousands of islands, each island maybe having a different dialect or language. So we can know that maybe 10% of them are Christian, 1.7 are Hindus. We can know also that there are 4 main islands in Indonesia, but Java, with the capital city in Jakarta, Java is the most populous, concentrated island in the country. Java has Jakarta as its capital city, and pretty much 40% of all the nation's population is focused in Java. It's the world's most populated island. It's home to more than 50% of the total Indonesian population. So again, let me correct myself. So 41% of the people group Javanese are in the island of Java. So 50% of all the population, so half of 260, about 200, I don't know, it's probably larger at the time, but so about 130 million, 150 million people live on the island of Java. See, just imagine how populated, how densely populated that is. The Sundanese, they're the second most populous group, which is 15.5%, and the Malays, 7.3%. They are in the island of Java. Indonesia's cultural and religious diversity is as vast as the number of its islands. Areas such as rural West Timor or Indonesian Borneo, Kalimantan, are worlds apart from the flashy shopping malls of downtown Jakarta, Indonesia's capital city, about 10 million people. So the future of Indonesia is bright, meaning that it's supposed to have the world's fourth largest economy by 2050. It's industrially productive, growing at a steady rate. Economy is growing at a steady rate. Experts project it's gonna be the fourth largest economy. Also, it's rich with nutrients and raw materials. It has coal. It's the world's largest producer of coal. So Indonesia has a lot of natural resources, a lot of bright, promising economic future. It's a nation that's going to be of global importance by the 21st century. The island nation is currently transitioning from an agricultural economy driven by commodity exports, raw materials, natural resources, to an economy based on industrial manufacturing and services, professional services. Professionals project that Indonesia will grow into the world's fourth largest economy by 2050. So this economic rise is partially based on demographic trends, because it's going to propel the country's population to about 321 million. So it's estimated that 70% of the population will be working age by 2030, a circumstance that will supply the nation with beneficial demographic structure, and it will have a labor pool like no other countries in the world. They're struggling with birth rates, and if you look at Japan was booming, economically booming. If you know the bubble, the economic bubble of Japan of the 1980s, even the 1990s, Japan was everywhere. Right? Japanese products were everywhere. Everyone thought Japan is gonna have it's gonna overtake the U.S. as number one in the world economy. But what happened was, no one talks about that now. No one talks about Japan surpassing the U.S. because one of them are birth rates. Population is going older and older. These people, the population in Japan is so old, is so aged, that this idea of birth rate basically translates to economic growth, because the common age of the population, 70%, about Indonesia, 70% of the population is going to reach the working age adults. They will have a population that is highly productive, highly it will supply the nation with a beneficial working age laborers. So it have a very heavy voluminous labor pool. It's not going to be age where they think about retirement. so on and so forth. So the world's economy, world's nations such as smaller other nations that have lower birth rates will decline in its economy because people who are being born will be about the same or less than the people who are aging and retiring. So we can know that Indonesia has huge, tremendous economic potential. Country's middle class is expected to double. So it's urbanizing and industrializing rapidly. And GDP is growing, but Indonesia is also characterized by deep religious disparities and regional disparities because heavily Muslim population. It's a country that's difficult to govern. There's a lot of corruption that happens. GDP per capita is less than half of the neighboring Malaysia. 27 million Indonesians still live on less than 0.75, so 75 cents a day. Life expectancy is 7 years lower than Vietnam. So to live up to its economic potential, Indonesia still needs to increase public spending, build up its infrastructure, bridge regional development gaps, curb corruption. There's so much corruption that happens in Indonesia. Provide stable, predictable governance, raise living standards, invest in healthcare, education, human capital development, and the middle class holds the key to unlocking potential of Indonesia. It's important to govern to support the growth of this group in all fronts. So the challenge in the educational system happens in this kind of demographic context, in this kind of economical context. Rising economy and a booming economy also translate to booming education. People won't talk about education unless they have something to live and eat and be okay, prosperous, right? And trends suggest that people focus on education when economy is booming, economy is okay. So this trend goes together. So we can know that rise in education also comes with rise in economy. As of now, Indonesia struggles to provide inclusive, high-quality education to its citizens, and that's just the way it is. Developing countries will kind of stumble through education. The country has lower literacy levels than any other Southeast Asian countries, so they're focusing, but there is no it's so hard. So there's so much population, so much. So there's so much diversity that's very hard to centralize this kind of education. So analysis by World Bank shows that 55% of Indonesians who complete school are functionally illiterate, compared to only 14% in Vietnam, 20% in member countries of organizations for economic cooperation and development. Tertiary attainment levels likewise are very low. Percentage of Indonesians, so secondary, primary, secondary, tertiary, so university, are very low. Percentage of Indonesians over age of 25 that had attained at least a bachelor's degree in 2016 were just under 9%, which means actually 9% of about 215 million is almost 10%, right? It's 2.5 million people. But so only about 10%, 2.5 million people went to get bachelor's degrees. But there is, so according to Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, There may not be much incentive to obtain a tertiary degree. Unemployment rates are highest among university-educated Indonesians. The research output of Indonesian universities is growing rapidly, but is still low compared with that of emerging economies. On the plus side, the mean years of schooling among the population above the age of 25 have doubled since 1980s. So 8 years in 2016, the pupil to teacher ratio dropped from 20 to 1 to 16 to 1 in elementary education between 2004 and 2017, even though these ratios remain flat. So UNESCO statistics show that its tertiary gross enrollment ratio leaped 20%, so it's growing. Compared to Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, it's still low, but it is growing, it is catching up. So mid-2000, Indonesia is implementing a broad range of education reforms, including decentralization of parts of its school system, improvements in teacher training and standards, sizable increase in educational spending, a share of the national budget. However, public education spending as a percentage of GDP has stagnated over the past decade, remains below recommended levels for emerging economies at 3.6 of the GDP. More substantial efforts will be required to overcome structural weaknesses in Indonesia's system, bring it up to standards of other fast developing countries in the dynamic ASEAN region. So we can know that most of Indonesian education happens informally. Formally, in the nation's idea, only 4% of its GDP goes into education. Education, again, when there's booming economy, there's more education because they have more to spend. But right now, it's still developing, it's still catching up to other nations. That is because when you get a university degree, it doesn't translate to automatic employment. There's high unemployment rate of bachelor degree Indonesians are one of the lowest in that region. So, but if we talk about religious education, Islamic education happens in the mosques. So this is kind of the education in the area of the public education, but religious education was a little bit different. Religious education in Indonesia, as I said, happens in the madras. Madras is very important because it basically so religious education, it is a compulsory subject in every Indonesian school. The schools must provide religious education to students of any religion. So this is to ensure the rights of each student is recognized. Indonesian Islam has been known for its adaptability to modern times, modern society. So, for instance, scholars argue that Indonesian Muslims are moving toward a democratic and pluralist Islam. So, the fact that Indonesian Muslims are working toward this creation of a democratic Muslim society, it further observes that the development Muslim society centers on this idea. And its modern Islamic community, this idea of religious education building a modern Islamic community based on a political movement, but the development is moving toward Western culture but understanding issues related to Islam. So issues such as human rights, democracy, gender equality are among emerging issues of Muslim scholars, and they've been facing this since the 1990s. So thanks to the growing number of Muslim schools, Islamic education has been able to promote Islamic teachings within modern society. The research on the curriculum of Muslim schools will prove that there is a reciprocal relationship between Islamic schools and Muslim society. This means that Muslim society demands or facilitates the development of Islamic schools, and in return, Islamic schools provide education that strengthens the character of Indonesian Muslims. So Indonesia has been able to develop a model of democracy compatible with Muslim majority country. So he found that the existence of civil institutions, public civility, are among the most important factors for creation of democratic state. So this idea of Islamic nations and Indonesia being the nation that teaches religious education. It's to basically because it's such a Muslim majority country, he found that the existence of civil institution, public civility are among the most important factors that create democratic states. Also, one of the biggest democracies, I guess the fourth biggest democracy of the world. So it happens politically as well, social development and political situation as well. So the last period of the 1990s, latter period of the 1990s, number of Muslim scholars such as Wahid, Majid, and other scholars played a huge role in shaping Islamic discourse in the media, but likewise Muslim organizations were very influential in grassroots processes. This idea of Islamic populism, Islamic education being this driving force. And also the increasing trend of conservative Islam in Indonesia described here. It leads several questions, including the role of Islamic education. What is the role of Islamic education in Indonesia? This basically tries to explain the positions of Islamic education, especially religious education teachers concerning issues related to moderate versus conservative Islam in Indonesia. The issues selected are the issues in which Muslims have different opinions, including issues this includes Islam and state, Muslim and non-Muslim relations, Islam and gender, non-mainstream Islam, Islam in the media. While the study is about Muslim schools in general, this research focuses on the curricula and teachers of Islamic education. So this idea that these issues, Islam and state, Muslim and non-Muslim relations, Islam and gender, non-mainstream Islam and Islam in the media, these issues are what concerns with Islamic education. Islamic education deals with all of this in Indonesia. So the basic assumption is that both the curriculum of Islamic teaching and the teacher's understanding of Islamic teaching are very influential on the students and society. So additionally, it is commonly understood that a curriculum is only a part of educational policy, but it also represents society's agreement on a certain subject. Religious education is compulsory in Indonesian schools, because Indonesian people view religion as a very important part of human life. Here is the most important thing. Indonesians regard religion as a very important part of their religious life. And it is compulsory to all the population of Indonesia. So curriculum is not just part of education policy, but it represents the society's agreement on a certain subject. So not just compulsory because it's education policy, but it's compulsory because it's very important to the issue. So important to know is that conservative and modern Islam is very different. And that kind of shows in the idea of different ideals in the education. Islamic education in Indonesia, religious education, more specifically Islamic education in Indonesia, generally has two meanings. First is religious education or Islamic education as subjects and parts of the school's curricula. Religious education is a compulsory subject in every Indonesian school. The schools must provide religious education to students of any religion. This is to ensure that the right of every student receives to receive religious education is fulfilled. Added to formal curriculum, number of non-religious oriented schools also provide other religion oriented activities at school, such as collective prayers and religious teaching and extracurricular activities. So they try to teach fairly, but additionally, Islamic education means an Islamic education institution that offers more religious teachings and practices at school compared to non-religious oriented schools. There are three types of religious education or Islamic education. There are three types of Islamic education institutions in Indonesia. Sekolah Islam, which is Muslim school, Madrasah, which is Islamic school, and Pesantren, which is Islamic boarding school. So there's three types. Sekolah Islam is Muslim school, Madrasah is Islamic school, and Pesantren is Islamic boarding school. I grew up personally in Indonesia. I grew up in a Christian boarding school and Christian international boarding school, and it has similar systems of pesantren, and I've seen these madrasa and pesantren across the islands of Indonesia. Islamic educational institution has a long history in Indonesia. It's existed prior to the advent of secular education. So before secular education came to Indonesia, before Indonesia became a more of a secularized or modernized country, Islamic education has a long history because Islam was brought by Arab traders and missionaries hundreds, centuries ago. Islamic education is deeply rooted with the people and the history of Indonesia. It has existed prior to the advent of secular education. Initially, there were just two kinds of Islamic education institutions: Muslim schools, as known as pesantren and madrasa. Pesantren is a boarding school that provides religious education for Muslim students. It is the oldest education institution in Indonesia. It is observed that there are no formal education in Indonesia between 20th century except pesantren. Initially, pesantren only offered religious education. However, due to higher demands of pesantren, it also teaches non-religious subjects. Most pesantrens now teach non-religious subjects such as math, sciences, and languages. Meanwhile, madrasas, the day-to-day schools, all-day schools, provide more Islamic teaching than their curricula when compared to secular schools. So first madrasa in Indonesia was built in 1909, West Sumatra, which is known as Madrasa Adabiyah. However, it took a long time before madrasa was recognized as a formal education institution, even after Indonesian independence in 1945. It began with the 1975 Ministry Decree on the improvement of quality of Islamic education, and was followed by 1989 National Education System Act before madrasa was recognized officially as formal education. So, madrasa in Indonesia was an educational system that God approved and widely recognized in 1989. Before that, centuries before that, pesantren was what was the prevalent religious educational institution of that time, Islamic boarding school. And people who sent the children there in pesantren or Islamic boarding schools, so they dormed there. So aside from pesantren madrasa, there is another formal Islamic institution known as Sekolah Islam, Islamic school. The term refers to day schools that adopt the Ministry of Education curricula, which is enriched with each school's own religious education. Since Sekolah Islam creates its own religious education curricula, the Ministry of Religious Affairs does not supervise their religious education. So Sekolah Islam is a little bit independent from the So these are some of the religious education of Indonesia. I want to talk about religious education in Malaysia. Religious education in Malaysia similar to religious education in Indonesia. They have all these schools, madrasa, Sekolah Islam, and so on and so forth. But what we need to know is that in Malaysia, we need to know a little bit of its historical background before we go into the actual religious system. So religion has been thought of a hindrance to growth of scientific and critical inquiries. So this clash between the church modern science, beginning with the age of reason, that happened in the West, but the notion that there is conflict between science and religion in Islam was a little bit different. So as you know, for religious education in Malaysia, it's a little bit different. So Malaysia is unlike Indonesia, religious education in Malaysia is different because Malaysia is a kingdom, it's a Muslim kingdom. So Islamic education in Malaysia first recorded its presence during the period of the Malaccan Sultanate, which is 1414 to 1511. So Malacca witnessed the birth of prototype boarding schools such as Pondok, literally meaning hut, which the master of or Tok Guru assumed its full control. So Malay students started to study Al-Azhar University in Cairo in the 1920s. So upon returning to Malaya, the new generation of Middle Eastern graduates significantly contributed to the changing face of Islamic education. They converted this Islamic Malaccan Sultanate era schools into madrasas, which was Islamic schools, adopting the structured system which combined instruction in Islamic fundamentals with Western influence pedagogy and technology, realizing deep attachment of Malays to Islam. The British at that time who colonized Malaysia, the Malay Peninsula, the British incorporated some form of Islamic education into Malay vernacular schools. With Malaysia's independence, centralization of the administration of curricula of all schools that offer some kind of Islamic education has dominated the Ministry of Education's effort in the realm of formal Islamic education. There is continuous endeavor to bring an end to dualism between secular and religious education. And there is a push toward one. There is this integration happening more than Indonesia. There is continuous endeavor to bring an end to dualism. So this integration that's happening as manifested in the marriage between Islam and secular sciences to tertiary level courses in 1973, a religious education division. Bahagian Pelajaran Agama was established with the Ministry of Education to coordinate Islamic education. 1983 was a renamed Islamic Education Division, Bahagian Pendidikan Islam. In 1995, it was restructured and Islamic Moral Education Division, Bahagian Pendidikan Islam dan Moral. It is now reverted to Islamic Education Division, and its task is to manage Islamic education policy and curriculum. The Arabic language policy and curriculum, the recruitment and in-service training of Islamic education, Arabic language teachers, and missionary and leadership training for Islamic education staff and students, and to aid and to raise the standards of both national secondary religious schools. Centralization of this administration curricula for all schools that offer some kind of Islamic education has dominated Ministry of Education's efforts in the realm of formal Islamic education. Curriculum has been designed to accomplish aims of the Islamic philosophy of education. There is continuous endeavor to bring an end to dualism between secular and religious education, as manifested in the marriage between Islamic and secular sciences and tertiary level courses. So, the idea of this is that Malaysia has its pride as one of the most prominent kingdoms of Islam. And this Malaysian-based scholarship of Islamic education, they take pride in that from the Sultanate, we can know that Islamic education happens whether in an individual or institutional basis. This is far from marginal, and they are very advanced in that Islamic education is very much developed in a way that they are focused on integrating this marriage between secular and religious ideas. Malaya is historically situated in Malaysia, Kingdom of Malaya, previously was called. It's historically situated in the confluence of ancient Eastern and Western trading routes. Medieval Malaysia, a term traditionally used by scholars to describe the whole of the Central Malay Indonesian archipelago, which encompasses the modern Southeast Asia, was exposed to a host of Arab, Persian, Chinese, Indian, European economic civilizations. So with this, there had to be some kind of religious interactions that happened. So Malays, foreign Muslims developed ostensibly on trade, commerce, that behind it lay deeper with missionary impulses such as Malays and for Muslims, there was a connection between them. So since between when Malaysia gained its independence, it's in 1957, and its separation from Singapore, distinction from Singapore, Malaysia had to go through certain changes in its modernization, but its religious education was somewhat different from Indonesia in that it focused on the harmony and the marriage between not just religious education but also the sciences, and it focused on the integration between not just religious education but also secular education as well. So in a brief overview, quick overview of Indonesian religious, of Malaysian religious education in pre-independent Malaysia. From the moment Prophet Muhammad received his divine revelation 6:10, Islamic education began via informal channels connecting him with a close circle of relatives, Mecca, Medina, and the Hijaz. Islamic education, what is seen today, recorded earliest, is during the Sultanate of Malacca. Sultans Mansur and Sia, they developed religious education in Malaysia. This idea of Sufi and Ulama developed in Malaysia. In Malacca, residential schools known as Pondok was again part of it, and then missionaries came and students came from Middle East, and they transformed that. The 1920s, influenced by the emergence of the steamship as a mode of transportation, and it made Suez Canal very important in trade. So the flow of Malay students to Azhar University in Cairo, very important, and they learned and they came back, and they pretty much this Wahhabi inspired militant exodus of properly cleansing Islamic faith, and they had these Middle Eastern influences in Malaysian religious education. So upon returning to Malaya, a new generation of Middle Eastern graduates significantly changed the face of Islamic education. They converted pondoks to madrasas, combined instruction in Islamic fundamentals with Western influence, pedagogy and technology. Students were assigned formal classrooms based on age groups, taught modern sciences, and subjected to written examinations. So these changes happened in Malaysia based on students who returned from the Middle East, especially the University of Cairo. Madrasas were an important part after that. But what is important is the contemporary setting of Islamic education, that was the history. Since Malaya's independence in August 31, 1957, Malaysia became known as Malaysia. Jurisdiction over Islamic education occupied a gray area between federal government and the 9 state governments whose Malay rulers act as heads of the Islamic religion and their respective states. Such authority over Islam vested in Article 3 of the Federal Constitution, which also pronounced in separate clauses positions of Islam as religion of the Federation and of the reigning Yang di-Pertuan Agong, the constitutionally appointed monarch, rotated every 5 years among the 9 sultans as the heads of religion in states without the hereditary rulers. Officially, education is located under federal authority in the 9th schedule of the constitution, but since Islamic affairs are technically administered by the various states, their governments have traditionally wielded considerable autonomy over Islamic education. This power is most lucidly articulated in the running of religious schools. So until a decade ago, a landscape of primary, secondary level Islamic education in Malaysia was made up of 5 types of religious schools. Federal religious schools, state government's religious schools, schools run by states, Majlis, Agama Islam, community religious schools, and private religious schools. So 5 types of religious schools. So federal religious schools, Sekolah Agama Persekutuan, and Sekolah Kebangsaan Agama, which is federally run religious schools. State government's religious schools, Sekolah Agama Negeri, which is state-run. Schools run by states, Majlis Agama Islam. Community schools, which is Sekolah Agama Rakyat. Private religious schools, Sekolah Agama Swasta. So these Sekolah Agama Rakyat, Sekolah Agama Swasta are independently managed but accept the use of national curriculum so that graduates can further their studies in formal institutions, rather formal institutions of higher learning. This encouraged perennial problems concerning these schools. Religious schools had to be acute shortage of places for further education, the tertiary levels of Malaysia. Only 3 state-run institutions, UN, UKM, UN offered Islamic Studies degree courses which accepted students based on secondary level of specialization, Islamic subjects per se, or professional degree and program. In all universities, a host of extra qualifications remain sine qua non for the admission of religious schools and graduates. So these are the religious systems of Malaysia, religious education in Malaysia. I'm gonna change my gear and talk about religious education in Israel. Middle Eastern religious education, I'm not gonna cover it today because I think I covered Islamic education in Indonesia and Malaysia. I'm gonna try to focus more on the religious education in Israel. We know we have gone through this religious education in study of the aspects that preserve Hebrew language, Jewish identity, engagement, and continuity, study of the tenets, principles, Torah, Talmudic education, Jewish people, education and gender. We covered this in such a way that really religious education here happens in the home that preserves identity, Hebrew identity. And religious education in Israel focused on generation after generation, study of the tenets, principles, Torah, Talmudic education, Jewish people. And Islamic education compared to Islam talk about not just the cultural preservation, but also it has to do with Hebrew language. And I mentioned that Islam also focuses on language, the Arabic language. But in Israel, the education was also what preserved the Hebrew language. Everything was in Hebrew. It was a Hebrew school. It preserved not only language, it preserves identity, culture engagement, and continuity. So I wanted to mention that because Israel is part of the Middle East. I want to mention that as well. Religious education in modern Russia. Religious education in modern Russia. In modern Russia, Russia is a country that after Soviet Union, since 2010, Russia began shifting to a new federal education standard where courses on world, religious, cultures, and secular ethics became compulsory. 2012, a academic course called the Fundamentals of Religious Culture and Secular Ethics became mandatory for schools in educational program. In Russia, in some Western countries, Russia is seen as a Western country, but I included them as Eastern because it's above Asia. A public discussion on the necessity of religious education in schools arose in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union. However, the core context of this discussion were very, very different. While in European countries, a crucial reason for introducing religions at school was a call for diversity management linked with a massive migration flows. In Russia was an attempt to fill the supposed ideological vacuum caused by the collapse of the Marxist-Leninist value system. In keeping with these objectives, Toledo principles like the methodological basis for teaching religion in the West pursue a goal for the respect of human rights, reducing prejudice and stereotypes. In Russia, the course of learning religious cultures emphasized essential national values such as patriotism, social solidarity, citizenship, family, labor, and traditional religions. First attempts to introduce faith in schools were made in the late 1990s by regional administrations. In that context, it was assumed that pupils would not only study Orthodox culture, courses on Orthodoxy under different names were incorporated into syllabi in 15 regions. For instance, Basics and Values of Orthodoxy in Belgrade, Fundamentals of Orthodox Culture in Kursk, Fundamentals of Orthodox Culture Ethics in Novosibirsk and Smolensk, History of Orthodox Church in Voronezh and Rostov-on-Don. So Orthodox religion was a predominant religion in Russia. From about 1990 to about 2010, the Russian Orthodox Church attempted to become the legitimate participant in the educational process. The diocesan subdivisions were enthusiastically involved in writing textbooks and conducting teacher training. Coordination Council on Interaction between the Ministry of Education and the Russian Federation and the Moscow Patriarchate was established in 1999. By this time, such councils have existed nationwide, not only in region of Russia, but every municipal unit if it has its own Department of Education. So one can assume Russian Orthodox Church had a vested interest in making presence of schools in order to recruit young members. The number of people who consider themselves Orthodox Christians is increasing according to different statistics. The number of believers increased significantly in recent years from 35% 2014 to 53% in 2017, with only 13% saying that they did not believe in God's 2017. So Very interesting history. There was no state religion, probably atheism, until 1990, fall of the Soviet Union. After Soviet Union, Orthodox Christianity replaced as the majority religion. Only 13% saying that they do not only believe in God. Yet this does not mean that all of these people attend services or follow required stricter religious restrictions. According to a survey conducted out of 67% of Russians stating that they belong to Orthodox Church, so 13% attend services at least once a month. 70% do so only from time to time. Only 2% responded to observe every fast, while 69% do following fasting restrictions. It goes without saying that the church has an eye on such trends. The practice of studying Russian Orthodoxy in school provoked heated discussions among politicians, education, clergy, and parents on the grounds of respecting the country's multinationalism. It was decided to introduce modules on other so-called traditional religions such as Russia, such as Islam, Buddhism, and Judaism, such as well as certain regular secular courses, leading to the creation of multi-modular courses on the fundamentals of world religion, such as cultures of fundamentals of secular ethics. In 2010, courses on religious education were taught as parts of a regional component of the syllabus, but since 2010, Russia began shifting to a new federal educational standard where a course on world religion, religious cultures, and secular ethics became compulsory for pupils. In 2012, an academic course called The Fundamentals of Religious Cultures and Secular Ethics became mandatory in any school's education program. The idea was to develop the abilities of elementary school children to communicate and to interact in multi-ethnic, multi-religious society on the basics of mutual respect and dialogue for the sake of social peace and cohesion. The division into modules were aimed to provide in-depth learning of religious cultures in framework pupils or parents, so they can choose between 6 of the modules: fundamentals of Orthodox culture, fundamentals of Islamic culture, fundamentals of Buddhist cultures, fundamentals of Jewish culture, fundamentals of world religious culture, secular ethics. So they can choose between one of 6 modules. Presently, in religious education, course is given 1 per class per week for students in the 4th grade by primary school teachers, and no marks are given. What are the modules? By parental choice. If one looks at official statistics on the structure of module choice over the course of time, one notices that the secular models, which include secular ethics and fundamentals of world religions cultures, are more popular among pupils' parents than those related to religious cultures. Secular subjects were chosen by more than half of 4th graders, 65% in 2012, 57% in 2018. Respectively, secular ethics is more than twice as popular as fundamentals of world religious cultures. For example, during the 2017-2018 academic year, about 41% of 4th graders studied ethics, and only about 17% studied religious cultures in general. Although models related to particular religious cultures have been less popular so far, they show an upward trend. So they have 6 modules, basically. In conclusion, concluding everything, theoretically, the course of fundamentals of world religious cultures and secular ethics have a modular structure that welcomes a free choice in accordance with personal beliefs and values. In fact, this free choice is only on paper because none of the parties involved is interested in sectional diversity or free choice. For the educators, diversity is difficult to manage and requires learning extensive new material. It complicates the schedule, and they must pay substantial sums to purchase new textbooks, often on a set for each pupil. Parents who are against the course do not want emphasis placed on cultural differences between their children and friends. Their religious community looks for non-competitive study, conventional religious traditions, basically orthodoxy. Over several years, while excluding discussions on secular ethics, taken together, religious education in Russian schools today rests on discrepancy between alleged goals of the fundamentalists, of course, which emphasizes multicultural education, and its realization, implementation, which stems from practical constraints, parochial agendas. So they are trying. So 6 major modules, and they can choose between them, but most are still reluctantly toward Orthodox. And I want to transition over to Japan, religious education in modern Japan. I want to talk just about contemporary Japan. So in Japan, religious education is usually divided into 3 categories: education concerning knowledge about religions or religious knowledge, in calculations of religious sentiment, and confessional education. Education regarding religious knowledge can be taught at public schools, while confessional education is prohibited. There have been extensive discussions on the inculcation of religious sentiment since post-war period. Some insist that it should be taught even within public schools. Others strongly oppose this view due to primarily to the perceived negative consequences of the imposition of state Shinto during pre-war period, when the state and religion, so shrine Shinto, were inextricably bound. The basic law and education were revised in December 2006, soon after the inauguration of Abe Shinzo cabinet. So basic law education were revised. The article concerning religious education was moderated slightly with a general learning regarding religion added to the statute language. However, as Japanese society has tended to avoid discussions regarding religious education post-war period, it is largely likely to be quite different to establish a new education plan based on already well-entrenched positions. Particularly with respect to the inculcation of religious sentiment, the idea of religious culture education had been introduced recently as a possible way through this impasse. So very interesting. Shinto Buddhism is the main religion in Japan. State Shinto was linked with the shrine Shinto, which if you see Japanese prime minister going to the Shinto shrine and they bow at the shrine, this is a huge political deal, because that's basically saying Japan wants to go back to its pre-war glory in the World War II, right? World War II, they aligned themselves with the Axis power, and state shrine Shinto was tied with pre-war Japan. So post-war Japan, they have constitutions laws that prohibit them from teaching them in curricular, but there's efforts now with Abe Shinzo's cabinet that try to change the laws. So Shinto, state Shinto, that's very prominent in Japan. That's the religious education right now. In China, it's a little bit different. State religions in China. State tightly control religious education. Religious education, what you know from other religions, China tightly controls all. So China does not allow religious communities to run schools for children, even though regulations do not forbid the provision of religious education to minors. nor is religious education provided in state schools. For students beyond school age, only state-approved religious groups affiliated with China's 5 stated backed monopoly faiths are allowed to apply and set up institutions for the study of their faith, running training of clergy. So restrictions are especially tight in Tibet and Xinjiang. The state limits the number of such institutions and their size. Establishing new colleges is cumbersome and long drawn out, even when successful. Their curricula must include politics and patriotic education as defined by the state. The state also discourages religious activity on general university campuses. These restrictions reflect the authoritarian state's desire to control religious groups, including by intervening in the training of their leaders and the level of education of their members. Only state-approved religious groups are affiliated with China's 5 stated monopoly faiths, allowed to apply, set up any educational institutions tightly gripped in China. State-controlled, state-given. So very important to know. In modern Korea, there's North and South Korea. North Korea very state-controlled. Critical education in Korea. Korean religious education, some problematic issues related to Korean education. 4 critical aspects pertaining to religious education is found today in the Republic of Korea. The first section will begin to identify communicational dilemma of religious education in Korea and its roots of lack of proper understanding of religious education from a non-confessional academic perspective. So Korea and its religious education, they're taught to more about just ethics, morality, rather than a certain religion. Because of Korean religious demographics, it pertains to the necessity of religious education and the conventional image of religious education within schools. Thirdly, there are critical issues that analyze different kinds of religious education in Korea. So in Korea, full-fledged modern religious education programs, we find this in Europe, North America. Despite Koreans have been teaching about religious schools for quite a long time, problem rooted in misunderstanding of the concept of this idea of applying religious education began in mission schools such as other schools. There has been different kinds of religions that set up schools in Korea that taught maybe Buddhist missions, Christian missions, Catholic missions that belong to certain new religious movements such as other religions that have sprung up in the past. The idea of church and state, similar to most modernized countries, public schools try to avoid exploration of such subjects. So public schools